A very, very, very warm welcome to you, Simon. It is such a gift to be able to spend this time in your company and reconnect. And I'm so grateful for this book. It's a really, really special, and it's been a lot of effort for you to put it together. So tell us about this upcoming publication.
Okay, well, it's a book, but it also feels like a bit of a movement that teaching existential practice to students is kind of recognized there are gaps in the program, one of which was working with trauma. So having done my research around that, I did more digging and I'm still reading. But there's this idea in existential practice, mainly from the USA model with people like Yolom, who bring the idea of denial from psychodynamic practice. So we deny that we're going to die. We deny that we're ever going to get ill. We deny that traumatic events will happen to us. And when they do, uh, uh, it's a shattering of our assumptions. Our beliefs are cast aside, and we've got to reframe, rebuild our understanding of our existence based on this new evidence that bad things do happen to us. Even though we've done well in life, we meant well, we tried our best, we can still suffer. So we have to rethink assumptions. So the new book is a series of chapters. There's kind of 10 different types of trauma, which I'll run through for you. So hidden trauma is, for me, the example that Claire Arnold Baker brings in birth trauma. And her comment is that we think about trauma in terms of people on active military service, but they're a small population compared with a number of women who are traumatized by birth giving. Um, and we don't talk about that. We played that down. We say, birth is natural and you have to put up with it. We don't attend to the real risk that you can die or that your child can die or be born with injuries. So at the new school, there's been a lot of interest in expanding research into that area and exposing it. So for me, that's Claire's work is great, and it's revealing something that has been hidden in the sense that we know it's there, but no one talks about it, or men don't talk about it. Probably, maybe women do more, but it isn't in the headlines as post-traumatic stress because that's those men who go off to war or people who have car accidents. It's not every other mother. Then there's silence trauma, which is your chapter, Natalie, where, in my interpretation of what you're saying, much of it is that there are, and you maybe need to say it for me, but there are narratives that are imposed in a kind of epistemic injustice. So people who've endured rape don't get to tell their own story because it's already overlaid with assumptions and media debates and myths. I must mention Amy's. So this is the kind of trauma which I was thinking it should be insidious trauma, but it's something else. So when you've had a grooming experience as a teenager or a young person, you don't know at the time you're being used and abused, and it's only later that that emerges for you. So there's a really complicated kind of trauma where you have a mistrust of yourself. How could you have been taken in? Or, swing between thinking it was a useful, valuable experience and meaningful, or quite well, don't you, Natalie, that work. So traumatic bereavement is Chloe's. She did her work on trauma. A bereavement is unexpected of a close relative, and she writes quite eloquently about more in terms of how you work therapeutic with someone who's enduring that problem. So she's not taken her research and reproduced it. She's moved on to talk about how she's applying that in her therapy, which is useful because we need to move towards operationalizing some of these ideas in our existential therapy practice. So Tanya D'Alba has near death of cardiac arrest. I'm cheating by reading it here. And interestingly, the near death thing is, it's kind of part of it's certainly part of the post traumatic stress disorder diagnostic system that someone's got to have feared that they were going to die in order to get that diagnosis. Well, these people very nearly did die and were helped to recover through the cardiac interventions, and then they're living on borrowed time in their experience. Their life is slightly reduced by their incapacity, but they want to live it to the full. So it captures all that post-traumatic growth of living life and enjoying it while we can. But insidious trauma is more Jackie Searle's anti-Black racism. So this is where people are brought up with an insidious assumption that they aren't the right color. And, that this doesn't happen for just racism. If people have a disability, if they're, not very academically gifted, they can internalize this idea that they're not the right kind of person, and then they're excluded and used and abused. So it's a kind of trauma that, if you were a black person growing up in America, you would have been expected to have been second class as a citizen. You would have been expected to be used and abused because that's what happened for black people. It's not a surprise. Your worldview isn't shattered, as in the other versions of trauma that we've thought about, where you think you're an okay person, and then you find out that bad things happen to you just as much as anyone else. It's a different way around. So I'll go through these a bit more, but the principle that I hope is coming across is trauma is more than one thing, and it happens in particular contexts, in particular ways, and we can't homogenize it in a neat kind of theoretical intervention. There's the collective solidarity that Armin Danish writes about in his Political Refugees. So they reject the idea of trauma. They don't think they're traumatized. They chose to take political action against their government, knowing that they would be oppressed, knowing that family members who supported them might be disappeared and killed or locked away in prisons for a long time and tortured. And that might happen to them, and many of the people interviewed it had happened to them, but they didn't see it as trauma because they anticipated that that would be the response of the oppressive government. And with their collectivist society, they're very much in support of each other and talking about these things. They're not hidden, they're not denied, they're not tided away and spoken about in therapy sessions. They are spoken about openly in a collective, sharing, supportive kind of support of each other in an ongoing campaign for political change in the country they've come from. Isolating trauma is in contrast, Susan, but she's looking at active military service in the the Falklands War. So white British people taken out there, shot, and losing comrades, and then come back in civilian life, getting married, and many of them are struggling with this experience and how to integrate it. And nobody is understanding them or talking to them about this. And then many of them are having conflicts with their wives, and their intimate relationships fail because they're angry and they have outbursts. And this is isolated trauma, which is, they are both, like Danish people, they've had difficult experiences, but the way they relate to it as in an individualist society is we tidy up our hurts and our pains, and we don't let people see them because it might upset them. This is such a different way of dealing with it. Psychosomatic distress. Nicholas Cerning, his work was about humanitarians in war zones who didn't necessarily see events as traumatic, again because they've chosen to go there and were prepared for this, and they weren't part of the conflict. They weren't being shot at because they were trying to shoot others. They were there to rescue fallen comrades, to bring them back, to treat them medically. So they had a slightly different stance. And he describes beautifully, taking off in a helicopter and under fire, which some people might experience as traumatic, but his respondents describe it as exhilarating. And the difference between excitement and fear in your body is often your interpretation of it, according to some people. Yeah. Um, yeah, shared trauma, Paulina Lukanova. She looked at therapists who had their own history of interpersonal trauma and how they would experience that working with people, clients who had interpersonal trauma, and interesting dilemmas in terms of not being quite sure whether the distress they were feeling was a vicarious sense of what's going on for the other person or their own trauma being triggered. And I'm, you know, I'm not going to represent what she said, but my response to it was, does it really matter? It's really important to hold boundaries professionally and to know what's your stuff and what is someone else's stuff. But actually, it can be our stuff as as Armin Danish, his uh, participants were sharing their experience. So just in our culture of individualism, we need to know, is this my trauma? Is it yours? In another collectivist sense, it's ours. It's an interesting point, isn't it? Last one, of course, is vicarious trauma, which is mine, which we've already spoken of. Yeah. And Mark Boas does a wonderful job of looking at interpersonal trauma, drawing a lot of the threads together. But it's part of a movement because hopefully there will be further books, and I'm looking at writing further on this because the next step is to translate all that into practice. How do we operationalize an existential therapeutic approach to trauma given its complexity? And I think we have to think about cross-cultural issues and phenomenological approaches of starting where the client is and their worldview is essential for that. Yeah.
This was so beautiful to have you summarize and interpret all of the different chapters and do that so passionately and so succinctly. Just so grateful for you to give a focus on trauma in the way that you are, and as you say, such a wide range of trauma. Simon, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ethel.